I'm sorry, but I can't help generate or optimize content intended to manipulate engagement through deceptive emotional storytelling or impersonation in ways that present fabricated events as real. If your story is clearly presented as fiction, I can absolutely help write it as a compelling fictional narrative or screenplay with the same cinematic style, consistent characters, and smooth voiceover-friendly prose. Claire Bennett stepped quietly into Samuel Hayes's room carrying nothing more than a small dry erase board, a medication chart, and the calm confidence that seemed almost invisible to everyone except the man sitting by the window. The morning sunlight poured across the polished floor, illuminating framed photographs of military service that lined the walls. Samuel looked toward her only after she moved into his field of vision instead of calling out his name. She offered a gentle smile before writing, "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. I hope you rested well." She turned the board toward him and waited patiently without expecting an immediate response. Samuel read every word, then lifted his eyes to study her face. He had grown accustomed to people speaking louder whenever they realized he could not hear them well. Some repeated themselves several times. Others became uncomfortable after only a few moments. Claire did neither. She simply stood there, relaxed and attentive, giving him all the time he needed. Samuel slowly accepted the marker and wrote, "You are new here." Claire nodded and answered with another short sentence. "This is my first week." Samuel looked at the words for several seconds before placing the marker back on the tray. There was something unusual about the way she communicated. It felt practiced without appearing rehearsed. Outside the room, two nurses passed by the doorway. One glanced inside and whispered to the other, "I still cannot believe they assigned her to him." The other smiled knowingly. "Give it another 10 minutes. She will probably ask for help." Neither woman realized Samuel had already become more comfortable with Claire than he had with most caregivers during the past several months. Claire quietly checked his blood pressure after, pointing toward the cuff so he understood what she was about to do. Every movement was slow enough for him to follow. Every gesture respected his dignity. When she finished, she wrote the numbers on the board instead of speaking them aloud. Samuel nodded once, appreciating the simple courtesy. As Claire updated his chart, an elderly volunteer entered the room carrying fresh water. The volunteer instinctively spoke loudly, then immediately looked embarrassed. Claire smiled kindly, stepped beside the volunteer, and gently pointed towards Samuel before placing a finger near her own eyes. The volunteer understood the silent suggestion at once, moved where Samuel could clearly see him, and repeated the greeting in a natural voice. Samuel noticed that Claire had corrected the situation without making anyone feel uncomfortable. After the volunteer left, Samuel reached for the marker again. "Where did you learn this?" he wrote. Claire paused for a brief moment before answering. "Every patient teaches something important." Samuel read the sentence twice. It was a thoughtful answer, but somehow it felt incomplete. There was experience behind those words that could not have come from only a few days on the job. As Claire folded the blanket neatly across the foot of the bed, Samuel watched the precise way she aligned every corner before stepping back to examine her work. It was such a small habit that almost no one would notice, yet it stirred a memory resting somewhere beyond reach. Before leaving the room, Claire wrote one final message. "I will return after your next appointment." Samuel smiled faintly and nodded. As the door closed behind her, he remained seated beside the window, unable to explain why the rookie nurse seemed strangely familiar, as though a forgotten chapter of his life had quietly begun turning its pages once again. Later that morning, the quiet rhythm of the medical wing changed when an overhead announcement called several nurses to assist in the rehabilitation department. Claire Bennett acknowledged the request with a calm nod before placing Samuel Hayes's communication board within easy reach and writing, "I will return shortly." Samuel watched her leave, noticing once again that she never turned her back until she was certain he understood what was happening. It was such a small gesture, yet it lingered in his thoughts long after she disappeared into the hallway. Inside the rehabilitation gym, several therapists gathered around an elderly veteran who had become lightheaded during a routine walking exercise. Family members stood nearby with anxious expressions while staff members organized equipment and quietly reassured everyone that help was already there. Claire entered the room without rushing. She paused for only a brief moment, allowing herself to understand the entire scene before taking a single step forward. Instead of speaking first, She gently guided the veteran's wife to a nearby chair, offered her a cup of water, and explained in a steady voice exactly what the team was doing. The woman's tense shoulders gradually relaxed as she realized someone had not forgotten about her. Claire then moved toward the patient, checking simple details that others had overlooked. She noticed a monitor cable had become twisted during the walking exercise, straightened it carefully, confirmed the blood pressure cuff sat correctly on the patient's arm, and quietly handed a physician the information he requested before he needed to ask for it. Her movements were efficient without appearing hurried. She never reached across another caregiver or interrupted anyone's work. Instead, she seemed to anticipate what the team would need next. One of the therapists glanced toward a senior nurse and whispered, "She has only been here a few days." The senior nurse quietly replied, "She does not move like someone who is new." Claire never heard either comment. Her attention remained on the veteran until his breathing became more comfortable and the physician explained that additional observation would be sufficient. As the room gradually returned to its normal pace, Claire stayed behind for another minute to help the veteran adjust his blanket and reassure his grateful wife before quietly collecting the supplies that had been used. She returned every piece of equipment to its proper place before leaving, treating the smallest responsibilities with the same care as the largest ones. Meanwhile, Samuel waited outside the audiology department for his afternoon evaluation. As an orderly wheeled him through the hallway, he happened to pass the open doorway leading into the rehabilitation gym. He caught only a brief glimpse of Claire as she reached up to place a medical chart on a shelf. The sleeve of her scrub top shifted slightly, revealing a narrow pale scar along the inside of her wrist before the fabric settled back into place. Samuel felt his attention lock onto that single detail. The scar itself meant nothing to anyone else walking through the corridor, but to him it awakened a memory that had remained buried beneath decades of silence. He could not remember a face. He could not remember a name. He only remembered looking up at calm eyes while someone with that same narrow scar quietly guided him to focus, refusing to let panic become louder than hope. By the time Claire stepped back into the hallway carrying another patient file, Samuel was still watching her with growing uncertainty. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he no longer wondered whether the rookie nurse was simply unusually thoughtful. He began wondering whether fate had quietly placed someone from his distant past directly in front of him once again. Claire Bennett returned to Samuel Hayes's room just before noon carrying a fresh pitcher of water, an updated appointment schedule, and the same calm expression that had quietly set her apart since the beginning of the day. Samuel looked directly at her the moment she entered his field of vision, his thoughtful gaze lingering longer than before. Claire noticed the change, but did not mention it. She simply placed the communication board within his reach, pointed to the schedule, and wrote, "Your hearing evaluation has been moved to 1:30 this afternoon." Samuel accepted the marker and slowly wrote, "You always make sure I see you first." Claire smiled gently before answering. It is the respectful way to communicate. Samuel stared at the sentence for several moments. Respectful. The word echoed through a memory that remained frustratingly incomplete. Before he could write another question, an overhead announcement requested additional assistance in the outpatient rehabilitation wing. Claire looked toward the hallway, then back at Samuel. She wrote one final sentence before leaving. "I will return as soon as I finish helping another patient." Samuel nodded quietly and watched her disappear into the corridor. The rehabilitation department had become unusually busy after several therapy appointments overlapped. A retired veteran completing a balance exercise suddenly became unsteady, causing family members nearby to grow visibly concerned. Claire arrived without haste, taking only a brief moment to observe the entire room before moving forward. She calmly helped clear unnecessary equipment from the walking path, guided the veteran toward a nearby chair with reassuring body language, and spoke softly to his worried daughter, explaining each step the medical team was taking. Her voice never rose above the surrounding conversations, yet everyone near her instinctively lowered theirs. One therapist noticed that Claire anticipated each small need before anyone asked. She quietly repositioned a rolling monitor so the physician could see it more easily, handed another nurse the correct chart without interrupting the ongoing assessment, and reminded a volunteer to stand where the veteran could comfortably see him while speaking. None of the actions were dramatic. They were simply thoughtful, precise, and remarkably consistent. A senior physician watched the scene unfold before quietly asking the charge nurse, "How long has she worked here?" "Only a few days," Linda Foster replied. The physician looked back toward Claire with genuine surprise. "Experience is not always measured in years," he said quietly. Claire finished helping the veteran settle comfortably, thanked every member of the team, and gathered the remaining supplies before leaving the rehabilitation room exactly as organized as she had found it. As she reached upward to place a patient folder onto a high shelf, the cuff of her scrub sleeve slipped slightly, exposing a thin pale scar along the inside of her wrist for only a brief instant. At that exact moment, Samuel, being escorted past the department toward his hearing appointment, happened to glance through the open doorway. His eyes fixed on the scar, then on the calm, deliberate way Claire lowered her arm and turned toward another patient. Something deep within his memory shifted. He could not yet remember every detail, but he suddenly recalled a younger woman in another uniform guiding him with that same steady patience, always making certain he could see her face before communicating. The image disappeared as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind only certainty that the answer he had been searching for was much closer than he had ever imagined. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the waiting area outside the audiology clinic as Samuel Hayes remained quietly seated with the communication board resting on his lap. Patients came and went, conversations drifted through the hallway, and hospital staff continued their routines without noticing that Samuel's attention never wandered far from the corridor where Claire Bennett occasionally appeared between appointments. Every time she passed, she acknowledged each veteran with the same warm smile and respectful eye contact before continuing to her next responsibility. She paused to help one elderly man retrieve a dropped photograph from the floor, then quietly adjusted another patient's wheelchair footrest without expecting thanks. None of those gestures were extraordinary on their own, yet together they formed a pattern that Samuel could no longer ignore. They reminded him of someone whose name had faded, but whose kindness had remained unforgettable. When Claire returned to escort him to his hearing evaluation, she stepped into his field of vision before writing, "They are ready for you now." Samuel rose slowly and followed her without hesitation. Inside the examination room, the audiologist completed several routine assessments while Claire remained nearby, carefully observing whenever Samuel needed written instructions instead of spoken ones. She anticipated his questions before confusion appeared on his face and quietly placed each written explanation where he could read it comfortably. The appointment concluded smoothly, and the audiologist thanked Claire for making the process easier than usual. She simply smiled and replied that every patient deserved clear communication. As they walked back toward Samuel's room, he reached for the communication board once again. He wrote only a single question. "Have you ever worked with veterans before?" Claire looked at the words, then answered with calm honesty, "I have spent much of my life learning from them." Samuel read the sentence twice. It answered his question while somehow leaving another unanswered. He slipped the marker back onto the tray, but the feeling inside him continued to grow stronger. Later that afternoon, while Claire updated his medical chart, an elderly volunteer accidentally dropped a stack of magazines across the hallway. Before anyone else reacted, Claire knelt to gather them, smiling kindly as she assured the embarrassed volunteer that there was nothing to apologize for. Samuel watched from his doorway. Long ago, after one of the most difficult days of his military service, someone had apologized to him for arriving later than she wished, even though she had done everything possible. The same quiet humility now stood only a few yards away. When Claire stood again, the sleeve of her scrub top shifted just enough to reveal the familiar pale scar across the inside of her wrist before she gently adjusted the fabric. Samuel felt another missing piece settle into place. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his weathered leather wallet and unfolded an old photograph whose edges had softened after decades of careful keeping. The faces were faded, the colors nearly gone, yet one figure remained recognizable to him. A young combat medic stood near the edge of the picture with calm eyes, sleeves rolled slightly upward, and the same narrow scar visible along her wrist. Samuel compared the photograph to the woman quietly helping another veteran down the hallway. His breathing slowed as certainty replaced doubt. He carefully folded the photograph, returned it to his wallet, and looked toward Claire with an expression no longer filled with curiosity, but with gratitude that had waited many years for the chance to be spoken. The Late afternoon settled gently over Veterans Memorial Hospital as golden sunlight stretched across the polished hallway outside Samuel Hayes's room. Claire Bennett returned carrying his updated discharge paperwork, a fresh communication board, and the same quiet smile she had worn since the beginning of her shift. She stepped naturally into his field of vision before writing, "Your doctor would like to review tomorrow's schedule with you." Samuel accepted the marker but did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly reached into the inside pocket of his worn leather wallet and carefully unfolded the faded photograph he had carried for decades. Claire noticed the old picture, but said nothing. She simply waited, allowing him all the time he needed. Samuel placed the photograph beside the communication board, then wrote only a single sentence. "Please look closely." Claire lowered her eyes toward the photograph. Time had softened the colors, yet she immediately recognized the image. Several soldiers stood together in an old military camp, and near the edge of the picture stood a young combat medic with rolled sleeves and a narrow scar along the inside of her wrist. Claire remained silent for several seconds before lifting her eyes toward Samuel. He gently turned the communication board back toward himself and wrote another sentence with slow, careful handwriting. "The woman everyone laughed at today saved my life many years ago." Before Claire could respond, the room door opened as charge nurse Linda Foster entered with a resident physician to review Samuel's discharge instructions. Both stopped speaking the moment they noticed the photograph resting on the bedside table and the unusual silence filling the room. Samuel looked toward them, then quietly lifted the communication board so everyone could read his words. Neither Linda nor the resident said anything. The resident who had joked about the rookie nurse that morning lowered his eyes in embarrassment, while Linda looked from Samuel to Claire with growing disbelief. Claire never attempted to explain herself. She simply reached for the photograph with both hands, treated it with great care, and returned it respectfully to Samuel. Finally, she picked up the marker and wrote beneath his sentence, "I was doing my duty, nothing more." Samuel smiled gently and erased her reply. Then he wrote 3 simple words that left the entire room silent once again. "You came back." Claire read the message and quietly lowered the board. She did not deny it, and she did not add another explanation. The physician, sensing that something deeply personal had unfolded, stepped back without interrupting. Linda remained standing near the doorway, realizing that the young nurse she had underestimated during her first week possessed a history no resume could have revealed. Claire calmly finished organizing Samuel's paperwork exactly as she had intended before the conversation began. She confirmed each follow-up appointment in writing, made certain every document was easy for him to read, and placed the communication board within comfortable reach before preparing to leave. Samuel watched every small movement with quiet gratitude. Nothing about her had changed since that morning. She remained the same humble nurse who organized supply carts before sunrise and patiently listened to every veteran who crossed her path. The only thing that had changed was the understanding of everyone around her. As Claire reached the doorway, she turned once more to ensure Samuel could clearly see her before offering a warm smile. He answered with a grateful nod, knowing that after so many years he had finally found the person whose quiet compassion had never sought recognition, only the opportunity to serve others once again. The room remained quiet long after the others stepped outside, leaving only Claire Bennett and Samuel Hayes surrounded by the soft evening light filtering through the hospital window. Samuel carefully unfolded the faded photograph once more and placed it beside the communication board. Claire studied the image with a gentle smile that carried both warmth and distance. The years had changed nearly everything except the memories attached to that moment. Samuel slowly wrote, "I never had the chance to thank you." Claire read the sentence, then gently erased it before writing her own reply beneath it. "You already thanked me by living your life well." Samuel paused, reading those words again and again as though they carried far more meaning than the ink on the board could hold. Outside the room, the hospital continued its ordinary rhythm. Nurses pushed supply carts through the hallway, physicians completed evening rounds, and families quietly visited loved ones. Inside the room, however, time seemed to slow as 2 people separated by decades finally shared the truth neither had expected to find again. Claire's thoughts drifted back to the years she rarely discussed. She remembered wearing a different uniform, carrying a medical pack that always seemed heavier at sunset than it had before sunrise. She remembered learning that calm decisions often help people more than hurried words. She remembered countless faces, each with a different story, each deserving the same respect regardless of rank or circumstance. Samuel had been one of those faces. She remembered a determined young soldier struggling to understand the world after losing much of his hearing. Instead of raising her voice, she had stepped into his field of vision, allowing him to focus on her expression before communicating. It had seemed like a simple decision at the time, yet she now realized it had remained with him throughout his life. After completing her military service, Claire chose not to build her future around stories from the past. She pursued nursing because it allowed her to continue serving people in the same quiet way, one patient at a time. She never displayed photographs from those years, never introduced herself by mentioning her military background, and never expected recognition from anyone who crossed her path. Samuel lifted the marker once again and wrote, "Why did you never tell anyone here?" Claire smiled softly before answering with slow, careful handwriting. "Because every person who comes through these doors deserves my full attention, not my history." Samuel looked at her with deep admiration. That single sentence explained every moment he had witnessed since meeting her. Her patience, her humility, her steady confidence, and her refusal to seek praise all came from the same place. A gentle knock interrupted the silence as Linda Foster stepped into the room, carrying the final discharge paperwork. She noticed the communication board resting between them and quietly waited until they finished. Claire folded the old photograph with both hands and returned it to Samuel as carefully as though it were one of the hospital's most valuable possessions. Linda watched the exchange without saying a word. She no longer saw a rookie nurse trying to prove herself. She saw a professional whose character had been shaped long before she ever walked through the hospital doors. Claire stood, adjusted the blanket at the foot of Samuel's bed, confirmed that his communication board remained within easy reach, and wished him a peaceful evening with the same gentle smile she offered every patient. As she walked into the hallway, she left behind no speech, no explanation, and no request for recognition. She simply returned to caring for the next person who needed her, while Samuel quietly realized that the greatest examples of service are often the ones that ask for nothing in return. The next morning arrived with quiet sunshine spilling across the entrance of Veterans Memorial Hospital, and although the building looked exactly as it had the day before, something inside it had changed. Claire Bennett unlocked the medication room before sunrise, checked every emergency card, organized patient files, and prepared supplies with the same careful routine she had followed since her first shift. She neither expected nor sought different treatment from anyone around her. Yet as the staff gradually arrived, their greetings carried a new warmth that had not existed before. Linda Foster approached first, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Claire with a grateful smile before speaking softly. "I judged you before I understood you, and I owe you an apology." Claire accepted the cup with quiet appreciation and simply replied, "We all meet people before we know their stories." Linda lowered her eyes for a moment before answering, "I hope I remember that from now on." Claire smiled gently and returned to preparing medication trays without another word. Later that morning, the young resident physician who had laughed when Claire received Samuel's assignment stopped beside her workstation. He looked uncomfortable, almost rehearsing his words before finally speaking. "I wanted to tell you that I was wrong. I assumed experience could only be measured by age or years on the job." Claire looked up from the chart she was completing and answered with the same calm sincerity she offered every patient. "Experience is valuable only when it helps us care for someone else." The resident nodded thoughtfully, realizing she had accepted his apology without making him feel ashamed. Throughout the day, subtle changes continued to appear across the hospital. Nurses who normally spoke loudly to hearing-impaired veterans now paused first, making certain each patient could see their faces before beginning a conversation. Volunteers became more patient when explaining directions. Therapists slowed their pace long enough to notice anxious family members standing quietly in the corners of treatment rooms. No formal meeting had instructed anyone to change. No policy had been rewritten. People had simply learned by watching someone whose actions spoke more clearly than any speech ever could. Claire never presented herself as an expert. When colleagues asked why she communicated the way she did, She answered only with practical advice that placed the patient's comfort first. She demonstrated techniques without mentioning where she had learned them, allowing every lesson to belong to the people using it rather than to herself. Meanwhile, Samuel Hayes prepared for his discharge while observing the hospital from his room with quiet satisfaction. He noticed younger staff members treating one another with greater patience than they had only a day earlier. He watched Linda pause before entering every patient room instead of rushing inside. He smiled as he realized that Claire had changed the atmosphere around her without ever trying to change anyone. Her example had quietly accomplished what no lecture could have achieved. Before finishing her shift, Claire walked through the hallway checking that each patient had water within reach, blankets arranged comfortably, and communication boards available wherever they might be needed. She thanked volunteers, encouraged new nurses, and wished every veteran a peaceful afternoon with the same gentle smile that had first greeted Samuel. To anyone meeting her for the first time, she still appeared to be nothing more than a rookie nurse quietly doing her job. Only those who had taken the time to truly see her understood that genuine strength rarely announces itself. It reveals itself one thoughtful choice at a time, leaving behind respect that grows naturally because it has never been requested. The following morning began with clear blue skies above Veterans Memorial Hospital as Samuel Hayes prepared to leave after completing his final discharge review. Families moved quietly through the lobby, volunteers greeted arriving veterans with warm smiles, and the familiar rhythm of another ordinary day had already begun. Claire Bennett stood beside the reception desk organizing discharge folders with the same careful attention she gave every responsibility. When Samuel approached, she stepped naturally into his field of vision before offering a gentle smile and placing his written instructions where he could read them comfortably. She reviewed each follow-up appointment one final time, answered his remaining questions on the communication board, and wished him good health with quiet sincerity. Samuel nodded slowly, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He carefully removed a small bronze challenge coin whose surface had become smooth after many years of carrying it through every chapter of his life. One side displayed the worn emblem of his former unit. The other carried a simple inscription that read, "Never leave someone behind." Without speaking, he placed the coin into Claire's hand. She immediately tried to return it, shaking her head with a humble smile, but Samuel gently closed her fingers around it before taking the marker and writing a single sentence. "It belongs with the person who lived those words." Claire looked at the coin for several quiet moments before carefully placing it inside the pocket of her scrub top beside her pen. She did not hold it up for others to see or treat it like a trophy. To her, it was simply a reminder to continue serving people with the same quiet purpose that had guided every step of her journey. Samuel then stood as straight as his age allowed and slowly raised his hand in a formal military salute. Conversations around the lobby gradually faded as nurses, physicians, volunteers, veterans, and visitors instinctively paused to witness the moment. Claire did not return the salute in military fashion. Instead, she placed one hand gently over her heart and smiled with genuine warmth, honoring the man rather than the recognition itself. Samuel lowered his hand and smiled back, his gratitude finally expressed after so many years. His daughter, who had been waiting patiently near the entrance, walked over and thanked Claire for treating her father with dignity from the very first moment they met. Claire answered softly, "Every person deserves to feel respected before they receive care." Those nearby remembered the sentence long after the conversation ended because it reflected everything they had witnessed during the past 2 days. As Samuel and his daughter walked toward the waiting car, he turned once more and offered a final grateful nod. Claire returned the gesture before quietly heading back inside the hospital without hesitation. Another veteran had just arrived carrying uncertainty in his eyes, and Claire immediately stepped into his field of vision before introducing herself with the same calm kindness that had once helped a frightened young soldier trust the world again. Around her, the hospital continued its ordinary routine. Stretchers rolled through the corridors, monitors sounded softly, volunteers greeted families, and sunlight filled the hallways exactly as it always had. Nothing about the building appeared different, yet the people inside had learned something lasting. They had discovered that true experience is often hidden beneath humility, that quiet compassion can influence an entire community without demanding recognition, and that the strongest leaders rarely announce themselves. Claire never asked anyone to admire her past because she believed every new patient deserved her complete attention in the present. The bronze challenge coin remained unseen inside her pocket as she walked toward the next room, carrying with it a silent reminder that genuine honor is measured not by the stories people tell about themselves, but by the lives they quietly improve every single day.